3 weeks. That was how long Earl Pruitt had left before the bank would send someone to change the locks on the shop he had built with his own hands over the course of 19 years in the mountain town of Glenwood Springs, Colorado. The autumn of 1959 was already hard on Garfield County. The region had counted on the coal seams and the ranching trade and, more recently, a thin thread of tourist traffic moving along Highway 6 and the new interstate corridors taking shape across the Mountain West. But the automobile had done something to small-town commerce that nobody had fully predicted when the highways were first laid. It had made it easier to drive past a place than to stop in it. Glenwood Springs sat at the confluence of the Colorado River and the Roaring Fork, a town of roughly 4,000 people in 1959, with a main street that still held its original Victorian bones. The Hotel Colorado, rising 6 stories above the river, the old bathhouse drawing visitors in summer, the brown sandstone storefronts that had stood since the 1880s, when silver money and railroad ambition had made the town believe it was destined to become something larger than it ever quite managed to be. By the late 1950s, the population had neither grown nor declined in any dramatic way. It had simply aged. Young men with ambition drove down to Denver or over to Grand Junction. What remained was a working town, practical and weathered, that understood its own limits without grieving them too loudly. The ranch economy that fed Glenwood Springs ran on cattle and hay, on horses still used for real work in the upper valleys, and on the equipment that kept all of it moving. Farriers and blacksmiths were not romantic figures by 1959. They were not curiosities or relics. They were still necessary, because the terrain above Glenwood Springs, the narrow draws up 4 Mile Creek, the ranch roads above Carbondale, the high-altitude pastures above Basalt, still demanded working horses and the iron that kept them fit for that work. A good blacksmith in that country in 1959 was not a man living in the past. He was a man doing something essential that machines had not yet fully replaced. Earl Pruitt had understood that, and he had built his shop accordingly. The autumn had turned cold early that year. By the first week of October, frost was appearing on the window glass of the storefronts along Grand Avenue before sunrise, and the aspens up the canyon walls had gone from gold to bare in less than 2 weeks. The Colorado River ran steel gray and cold, carrying the first silty evidence of snowmelt from early storms already hitting the high country above Aspen. It was the kind of autumn that reminded everyone in Garfield County that the mountains set the terms, and the people simply arranged their lives around them. For most residents, that was simply the rhythm of the place. For Earl Pruitt, in the autumn of 1959, it was something more. The last autumn, he believed, that he would spend in the town where he had built everything he had ever owned. The town itself was aware of the shop's situation, the way small towns become aware of such things, not through announcement, but through the particular quality of silence that surrounds a man who is in trouble and too proud to discuss it at the counter of the diner. Pruitt's ironworks sat on the south edge of Glenwood Springs, a solid structure of corrugated iron and old timber that occupied a quarter-acre lot, fronting a dirt lane that ran parallel to the railroad tracks. The sign above the door had been repainted twice in 19 years, each time by Earl himself, each time in the same dark red letters that his father had used on the original sign when the shop had been located in a different town in a different state, before Earl had moved it west and made it his own. The forge inside burned hot and clean. The floor was packed dirt and coke dust, worn smooth by the passage of iron and boot leather over nearly 2 decades. The shop contained 9 anvils of various weights, a full complement of hand tools organized on wall racks that Earl had built himself, 2 leg vices, a post drill that had been purchased new in 1940 and maintained so carefully that it ran without a tremor, a mechanical blower for the forge, and a collection of specialized horseshoeing equipment that represented the particular expertise that kept the ranch trade coming to Pruitt's door year after year. The shop also contained on the back wall a calendar with 3 weeks of October still remaining. And under that calendar, on a wooden shelf, a letter from Mountain States Bank in Glenwood Springs stating that Earl Pruitt was in arrears on his commercial property loan in the amount of $4,260, and that failure to cure the arrears within 30 days of the letter's date would result in the initiation of foreclosure proceedings on both the commercial property and the adjacent residential lot where Earl and his wife, Ruth, and their 2 children had lived since 1944. The letter had arrived on September 22, 1959. Earl Pruitt was 44 years old that autumn. He had been born in 1915 in Lamar, Colorado, the second of 4 children of a man named Harold Pruitt, who had worked iron his entire adult life, first in Kansas, then in the southeastern corner of Colorado, then, briefly and disastrously, in New Mexico during the drought years of the early 1930s, when Harold had lost his shop and his savings in the space of a single bad season and had moved the family back to Lamar to start over. Earl had watched his father lose everything in that dry New Mexico year. He had been 16 years old. He had stood at the counter of a bank in a small town whose name he preferred not to speak aloud, and watched a man in a suit explain to Harold Pruitt, without cruelty and without particular concern, that the arithmetic of the situation was not in Harold's favor. Earl had learned 3 things that day. He had learned how banks spoke when they were about to take something from you. He had learned how his father's hands looked when they were holding a letter that could not be argued with. And he had learned, with the particular clarity that comes from watching a parent's dignity take damage it will never fully recover, that he would build something someday that no drought could reach. He had spent 20 years building it. After Lamar, after 2 years of working in his father's rebuilt shop and 3 years of working for a ranch operation outside of Pueblo, Earl had arrived in Glenwood Springs in the spring of 1940. He had come on the recommendation of a man named Clyde Harker, who ran cattle up 4 Mile Creek, and who had heard that the previous blacksmith in Glenwood Springs had retired without a successor. Earl was 25 years old. He had $412, a set of tools that had belonged to his father, and the specific knowledge of a man who had been doing ironwork since he was 10 years old and had never seriously considered doing anything else. He had leased a small building on the south end of Grand Avenue that first year, operating with the forge set up in the back of a rented space that had previously housed a feed operation. He was shoeing horses within his first week and doing general blacksmith work, gate hardware, wagon parts, custom tooling for the ranch operations, within his first month. In 1941, he had married Ruth Cavanaugh, the daughter of a hay farmer out of Carbondale, in a ceremony at the Congregational Church on Bennett Avenue. In 1943, their daughter Patricia was born. In 1946, their son Thomas arrived. By that point, Earl had been operating long enough and reliably enough that he had accumulated sufficient credit standing with Mountain States Bank to purchase the quarter-acre property on the South Lane, construct the shop building that would become Pruitt's Iron Works, and establish what he believed, and what the numbers seemed to confirm, was a sustainable business in a community that genuinely needed what he made. Through the 1940s, the work had been steady and the income reliable. The ranch operations around Glenwood Springs kept horses working the high country. The road building and bridge work that continued through the post-war decade generated ironwork orders from contractors who preferred local fabrication over shipping costs from Denver. Earl had developed a particular reputation for horseshoe work, a skill that requires not just metalworking ability, but a specific knowledge of equine anatomy and gait mechanics that takes years to accumulate. Ranchers from as far as Pitkin County and Eagle County drove their horses to Pruitt's because Earl Pruitt's shoes stayed on and fit correctly and rarely caused the sole bruising or quarter cracks that inferior fitting produced. That reputation was worth something that could not be easily calculated. It was the kind of professional credibility that kept phone calls coming even in slow seasons. But the 1950s had introduced a complication that no reputation could fully absorb. The mechanization of ranch work accelerated sharply after the war. Tractors became affordable for operations that had relied on draft horses. Trucks that could haul what horses had pulled became standard equipment on working ranches. The number of working horses in Garfield County did not disappear. It diminished, gradually and then more quickly, in a way that did not produce a single visible crisis, but instead produced a slow, cumulative pressure on the economics of a shop that had been calibrated to a slightly larger market than the one that remained. Earl had adjusted. He had expanded his general fabrication work, taken on repair contracts for mechanical equipment, and maintained his horseshoeing trade with those operations that still relied heavily on horsework in terrain where machines were impractical. He had managed the transition carefully and without panic. He had not expanded his debt beyond what the business could service. Then, in the summer of 1957, a horse named Copperhead, a 16-hand working quarter horse belonging to Randall Say of the Say Ranch up 4 Mile Creek, had developed a problem with his left front foot that 3 different shoers had failed to correct. Earl had studied the horse's movement, taken his time with the fitting, and built a corrective shoe that addressed the issue entirely. Randall Say had told every rancher he knew. The referrals from that single job had kept the shop busy for months. Earl had borrowed against the shop's property to purchase a new mechanical blower and a precision set of hoof-angle tools that cost $700 and paid for themselves within a year. He had believed, in the spring of 1958, that the business had turned a corner. He had been wrong about the timing. The drought that hit the mountain valleys in the summer of 1958 had dried up enough ranch operations that discretionary spending on horse care dropped sharply through the autumn. 3 of Earl's regular clients had reduced their horse herds by selling animals they could not feed. The road construction contracts he had maintained with a Glenwood Springs contractor named Pete Morales dried up when Morales lost 2 bids to a Grand Junction operation with larger equipment and lower overhead. By December of 1958, Earl was running the shop at roughly 60% of its usual revenue, which was not enough to cover his loan payment to Mountain States Bank while also maintaining his household expenses and the shop's operating costs. He had used the shop's small reserve account, $2,100 accumulated over 4 years, to make the spring 1959 payment, and had hoped that summer business would restore the balance. The summer of 1959 had not cooperated. A wet spring had delayed ranch work in the high country, compressing the season and reducing the number of horses needing seasonal shoe changes. 2 of his remaining regular clients had switched to a younger farrier from Rifle, who charged 15% less per horse. Earl had not dropped his prices because he could not afford to. The margin was already too thin, and so he had watched the work diminish further, week by week, through July and August. He had made no payment to Mountain States Bank since March of 1959. By September, he was $4,260 behind. He had gone to the bank on September 25th, 3 days after the letter arrived, and had sat across from the branch manager, a man named Gerald Foss, who had worked at Mountain States Bank since 1951 and who managed the Glenwood Springs branch, with the organized detachment of someone who thought of accounts in terms of columns and not in terms of the people whose lives those columns described. Gerald Foss was not a cruel man. He was a careful one. He had explained to Earl, with the same flat consideration that the suit-wearing man in New Mexico had extended to Harold Pruitt 30 years before, that the bank was not in a position to restructure the loan without a demonstration of improved business prospects, and that the arrears would need to be addressed within 30 days, or the foreclosure process would proceed according to the terms of the original loan agreement. Earl had asked about a payment plan, Foss had said that the bank's policy on commercial delinquencies required the arrears to be cured in full before any restructuring conversation could occur. Earl had asked whether a partial payment would delay the timeline. Foss had consulted a document on his desk and had said that a partial payment of at least 50% of the arrears, $2,130, made within the next 15 days might provide grounds for a brief extension, but that no extension could be guaranteed and that the full amount would still be required before the end of the original 30-day notice period. Earl did not have $2,130. He had walked out of Mountain States Bank with the letter in his vest pocket and had stood for a moment on Grand Avenue in the September sun and had looked at the mountains to the north and had not moved for nearly 2 minutes. Then he had walked back to his shop, stoked the forge, and gone to work on a gate order for a ranch up the Roaring Fork that needed to be finished by the end of the week. He did not tell Ruth about the conversation at the bank that evening. He told her the meeting had gone as expected. She looked at him the way she had learned to look at him when the answer was not the answer. A particular quality of stillness that meant she knew but was choosing to let him find his own way to it. Ruth Pruitt was 41 years old and had been watching her husband navigate hard seasons for long enough that she understood when to wait and when to push. She waited. Their daughter Patricia was 16 and attending school in Glenwood Springs, with the vague intention of nursing school after graduation. Their son Thomas was 13 and spent most of his after-school hours in the shop, learning the work the way Earl had learned it, by watching and then by doing, starting with the sweeping and moving upward through the hierarchy of tasks as his hands developed the strength and judgment the work required. Thomas Pruitt had not been told about the bank letter. He knew something was wrong because fathers who have problems carry them in their posture, and Thomas was old enough to read posture. Earl had tried 2 more approaches before the 30-day period reached its final week. He had spoken to a man named Dale Whitfield who operated a ranch supply and hardware business on the north end of Grand Avenue and who Earl had known for 15 years. Whitfield had listened carefully and had said he was sorry but could not lend what Earl needed. His own operation was carrying debt from a building expansion completed in 1957, and the margin was too thin. He had also spoken, through an intermediary, to a cattle broker in Carbondale named Jim Stoner, who was known to have extended personal loans to local business people in the past. Stoner had sent back word that he was committed to other obligations and could not help. That left 3 weeks, and then 1 week. And then the calendar on the back wall showed 5 days remaining. John Wayne had been in the Roaring Fork Valley since the 2nd week of October, staying at a working ranch outside of Basalt that belonged to a man named Hector Aldrich, with whom Wayne had developed an acquaintance through the cattle business over the previous decade. Aldrich ran a mixed operation of Angus and Hereford cattle on 1,800 acres of river bottom and bench land, and the 2 men had found a particular rapport in the combination of straight talk and shared disregard for unnecessary conversation that characterized both of them. Wayne was not in Basalt for any formal reason. He had completed filming obligations in California in late September and had taken the first available stretch of open calendar in what had been an unusually crowded 2 years, and had driven north and east through Nevada and into Colorado with no particular schedule, the way a man who has been working constantly will sometimes move when given the chance, without a destination, letting the road produce one. He was 52 years old that October, broad and settled in the way of men who have always been large and who have learned to carry their size without effort. His face had the particular weathering of someone who had spent substantial real-time outdoors over his lifetime, not just the artificial weathering of film work, but the genuine lines and color of a man who had been on actual ranches and actual desert terrain for extended periods throughout his adult life. His hands were large and calloused in a way that was not theatrical. He moved through space with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who had learned, somewhere along the line, that speed was rarely the answer, and that a man who moved slowly enough was rarely surprised. He had been in Garfield County before, had worked cattle in the high country during the early 1940s, during a period when his film career had been less than fully consuming, and had retained a particular affection for the mountain valleys along the western slope of Colorado, the quality of the light in autumn, the scale of the canyon country, the directness of the people who had chosen to build their lives at altitude. He was not unknown in the region. A man of his size and reputation could not travel through a county the size of Garfield without being recognized, and he did not pretend otherwise. But he had learned, across many years, that the way to move through a community without disrupting it was to do ordinary things in ordinary ways, and let people understand that he was not on display. He had been in Glenwood Springs twice during the 2 weeks he spent at Aldrich's ranch, once for fuel and groceries, once to accompany Aldrich to a meeting with a hay supplier whose office was on the east side of town. On the second visit, driving Aldrich's truck along the south lane on the way back from the hay office, Wayne had seen the sign above the shop, Pruitt's Ironworks. The forge smoke was rising from the stack, which meant someone was working. He had noted it the way a man who understands working operations notes things, automatically and without particular conclusion. On the third visit to town 3 days later, Wayne had come alone, driving a truck borrowed from Aldrich's operation. He had gone to the hardware store on Grand Avenue for a specific bolt fitting that Aldrich needed for a feeder mechanism, and on his way back through town he had taken the south lane out of habit or direction and had seen Earl Pruitt standing in the open door of the shop. The forge was dark. The fire that normally pushed smoke out of the stack was not lit. Earl was standing at the door with his arms at his sides and looking at the street in a particular way, not watching anything, not waiting for anything, just standing, with the specific stillness of a man who has come to the end of something and is standing at that edge. Wayne slowed the truck and stopped across the lane from the shop. He did not get out immediately. He watched for a moment, the way he had learned to watch before acting, reading the particulars of a situation before committing to a response. He took in the shop, the solidly built structure, the sign in dark red letters, the organized darkness inside where the forge normally burned. He took in the man, middle-aged, work-worn in the legitimate way, the posture of exhaustion that comes not from physical tiredness, but from the particular fatigue of running out of options. Wayne got out of the truck. He walked across the lane in no particular hurry, his boots raising small dust in the dry October morning. He stopped about 10 feet from Earl and looked at the sign above the door, and then looked at the man standing underneath it. "Shop's dark," he said. It was not a question, it was an observation made to see what an observation produced. Earl looked at him with the slow focus of a man coming back from somewhere interior. He recognized Wayne the way everyone in that region recognized Wayne, with a brief stillness, a recalibration, the slight displacement of expectation that comes from seeing someone whose face you know in a context where it doesn't belong. "It is," Earl said. "You close?" Earl was quiet for a moment. "Not yet," he said. "Few more days, maybe." Wayne said nothing to that. He looked at the shop again for a long moment, then looked back at Earl. "Mind if I look inside?" Earl shrugged in the way of a man who has stopped having strong feelings about small permissions. He stood aside and Wayne walked through the door into the cool interior of the shop. He moved through it without rushing, the way he moved through everything. He looked at the anvils, ran a hand across the horn of the largest one. He examined the wall tools in their organized racks. He put his hand on the post drill and applied weight to the handle and felt it run smooth without play. He looked at the leg vices and the mechanical blower and the collection of horseshoeing equipment organized on the rear shelves. He spent 4 minutes in there, unhurried, saying nothing. Then he came back to the door where Earl was still standing. "What do you owe the bank?" he said. The directness of it landed flat and clean, the way a stone lands in still water. No cushion, just the fact. Earl looked at him for a moment. $4,260, he said. He said it the way a man says something he has been carrying in his chest for weeks, with the particular flatness that comes from having thought about a number so many times it has lost its ability to wound. When? 5 days. Wayne looked at the shop door, at the dark interior, at the organized evidence of a working life. He looked at the calendar visible on the back wall, where the remaining days were still marked. "Come find me tomorrow morning at the Hotel Colorado," he said. 7 o'clock. "Bring the bank letter." He did not wait for an answer. He turned and walked back across the lane to the truck, opened the door, and drove away. Earl stood in the door of his shop and watched the truck until it turned onto Grand Avenue and disappeared. Then he stood there for another minute in the October quiet, listening to the river in the distance and the particular silence of a forge that had gone cold, and he understood that something had changed, though he could not yet have said exactly what. He did not tell Ruth that evening what had happened in the doorway. He told her only that he had spoken to someone who might have a solution and that he needed to be at the Hotel Colorado at 7 the next morning. Ruth looked at him with that quality of stillness again, but this time there was something different at the edge of it. She brought him a cup of coffee and sat down across from him and did not ask any questions. They sat together in the kitchen of the house adjacent to the shop, the house that was also under the 30-day notice, and they drank their coffee in the particular domestic quiet of people who have been serious together for long enough that silence is its own form of communication. Thomas came in from the shop where he had been sweeping, which was a thing he did sometimes in the evenings now without being asked, and Earl looked at his son's hands, already developing the breadth across the palm that ironwork produces, and felt the specific weight of what it would mean to tell the boy that the shop was finished. He slept that night. 7 in the morning, October 22nd, 1959, was cold in Glenwood Springs. The temperature at the Colorado River gauge station registered 31 degrees at sunrise, and a thin early frost had whitened the grass along the south lane and the parking area outside the Hotel Colorado. Earl Pruitt walked from his house to the hotel in 11 minutes, wearing his good coat and carrying the bank letter folded in the inside pocket. The Hotel Colorado's lobby was warm, lit by the chandelier lights that the management kept burning in the morning hours, when the temperature outside was below freezing. The desk clerk, a young man named Albert Reyes, who had worked the morning shift for 3 years, watched Earl come through the door with the specific attention that hotel employees develop for reading who belongs and who is uncertain. Wayne was already in the lobby, seated in one of the large chairs near the fireplace with a cup of coffee. He was wearing the same clothes he had worn the day before, cavalry shirt, leather vest, the Stetson resting on his knee, and he looked like a man who had been sitting in that chair for a while, comfortable in the settled way he carried everything. He looked up when Earl came in and gestured to the chair across from him. Earl sat. He reached into his coat and produced the bank letter without being asked and set it on the low table between them. Wayne picked it up. He read it completely, not quickly, moving through the language of the document with the careful attention of someone who has dealt with legal documents often enough to know where the operative details are buried. He set it back on the table. "Mountain States Bank," he said. "Gerald Foss. That's right. The 30 days run out Friday." "Yes?" Wayne said nothing for a moment. He drank his coffee. He looked at the fire. Then he said, "I want to go to the bank with you this morning, 9 o'clock. Earl looked at him. "You don't have to." 9 o'clock, Wayne said again, without raising his voice. He was not impatient. He was simply clear. Albert Reyes, behind the desk, was watching this exchange with the careful peripheral attention of someone who understands that what he is witnessing is not ordinary, though he could not have articulated precisely why. At 9 o'clock, John Wayne and Earl Pruitt walked into Mountain States Bank on Grand Avenue. The bank had been open for an hour. There were 2 tellers working behind the counter, Margaret Holt, who had been with the bank for 11 years, and a younger woman named Carol Bird who had started in July. There were 2 other customers in the building, neither of them doing anything that required immediate attention. Gerald Foss was in his office at the back of the building, a glass-walled room that gave him a view of the banking floor. He saw Earl Pruitt come through the door, which was expected, since the account was in its final days of the notice period, and distressed borrowers often came in as the deadline approached. He also saw the man who came through the door behind Earl, and he was quiet for a moment behind the glass wall while his mind organized what he was seeing. Margaret Holt at the teller counter had gone still. Carol Bird looked from Margaret to the door and back. The 2 customers at the writing desk both looked up. Wayne walked to the counter and stopped. He did not look at the teller. He looked at the glass office at the back of the room. Foss came out. He was a man of average height and careful grooming, with the particular quality of composure that bank managers develop, an ability to appear unrattled, regardless of what is happening. He came out of his office and walked across the floor and stopped at a reasonable distance and said, "Good morning. Can I help you?" Wayne looked at him. "You're Gerald Foss." "I am. I want to make a payment on this man's account." He indicated Earl with a slight movement of his head. "The full arrears, $4,260. The room, which had not been loud, went quieter. Foss looked at Earl, then back at Wayne. "I see," he said. He was recalibrating. Not showing it, but recalibrating. "And you are?" "I'm the man making the payment," Wayne said. It was not hostile. It was not theatrical. It was simply the answer to the question, delivered in the low, measured register that was Wayne's natural register, the voice of a man who had made many decisions and was accustomed to their consequences and was not interested in the performance of making this one. Foss looked at him for one more moment and then made the professional choice that the situation required. "Of course," he said. "Come to my office." They followed Foss to the glass-walled room. Foss sat behind his desk. Wayne sat in one of the chairs across from him, and Earl sat in the other. Foss pulled Earl's account file from a drawer. He had it immediately accessible, which told something about the state of the account and the attention Foss had been paying to the approaching deadline, and opened it on the desk. "The arrears as of today are $4,260, Foss said. "That would bring the account current through September of this year. The October payment would be due on the 15th. "What is the October payment?" $340. Wayne looked at the file on the desk, then at Foss. "I'll pay the arrears and 6 months of payments forward. What does that come to?" Foss worked the arithmetic on a notepad on his desk. His hand was steady. $4,260 in arrears, 6 payments forward at $340 each. That's $2,040, total of $6,300. Nobody in that room moved. Earl was looking at the surface of the desk. He was not looking at Wayne. He was not looking at Foss. He was looking at the grain of the wooden desk in the way that a man looks at something close and neutral when everything else is too large to look at directly. Wayne reached into the inside pocket of his leather vest and produced a leather wallet, broad and worn, that he set flat on the desk. He opened it and counted currency onto the desk surface in deliberate stacks. He counted large bills first, hundreds, then 50s, then 20s. He arranged each stack as he completed it, setting them precisely at the edge of the desk in front of Foss. He counted to himself without speaking, and the only sound in the glass office was the sound of currency being laid down, bill by bill, in the October morning. When he reached $6,300, he stopped. The money lay on the desk in orderly stacks, each denomination in its own column. He said, $6,300, count it. Foss counted it. He was thorough and unhurried, as a man of his position had to be, and he confirmed the amount twice and wrote it on the notepad, and then looked across the desk at Wayne. "The payment includes the full arrears and brings the account current," Foss said. "The prepaid payments will be applied through April of 1960. Mr. Pruitt's next required payment will be due on May 15th. "Write that down in a letter," Wayne said, "on bank letterhead, dated today. Give him 2 copies. Foss looked at him. "That is standard procedure," he said, which was not quite true, but was the right answer. He typed the letter himself on the typewriter on his credenza. He typed 2 copies on bank letterhead. He signed both. He handed one to Earl and kept one for the file. Earl took the letter with both hands. He sat looking at it for a moment. The letterhead of Mountain States Bank across the top, the specific language of a confirmed payment, the numbers, $4,260 in arrears cured, 6 monthly payments prepaid through April 1960, next payment due May 15, 1960. The signature of Gerald Foss, dated October 22, 1959. He did not speak. Wayne stood. He extended his hand to Foss, who shook it with the particular firmness of a man trying to make a solid impression. Then Wayne walked out of the office and across the banking floor and out the front door. Earl came out 30 seconds behind him and found him standing on the sidewalk in front of the bank, looking up Grand Avenue toward the mountains. "I don't know what to say," Earl said. Wayne looked at him. He was quiet for a moment, the unhurried quiet of a man for whom the right kind of silence is more useful than any particular word. "Get your forge lit," he said. He walked up Grand Avenue, unhurried, and did not look back. Earl stood on the sidewalk outside Mountain States Bank and held the letter in both hands. Margaret Holt, at her station inside, could see him through the glass door. She would describe it later that afternoon to her husband over dinner, the way the man stood on the sidewalk, not moving, holding the paper in both hands, for nearly a full minute in the October cold. The word moved through Glenwood Springs the way word moves in a town of 4,000 people. Margaret Holt told her husband. Her husband told the man at the counter of Whitfield's Hardware, where he stopped on his way home. Dale Whitfield heard it and was quiet for a moment, and then said something that he did not expect to become the thing people remembered. That shop should have never been in trouble to begin with. He said it to no one in particular, and it ended up quoted in a dozen subsequent conversations. Carol Bird, the younger teller, told a friend over lunch at the diner on Grand Avenue, and the friend told 2 others, and by mid-afternoon the story had traveled to the hardware store and the hay operation and the 2 gas stations and the feed yard on the east side of town. Albert Reyes, back at the Hotel Colorado, heard it from a guest who had been in the bank that morning. He thought about the 2 men he had seen in the lobby at 7 that morning, the large man in the leather vest with the Stetson on his knee, and the quieter man in the good coat across from him. The coffee and the letter and the brevity of the conversation. He would remember it for a long time, the specific economy of the whole thing, the way nothing was said that didn't need to be said. Earl went back to the shop. He built the fire in the forge, feeding coke into the fire pot and working the blower until the temperature climbed to where the metal would move. He put a bar of iron into the fire and waited, watching the color change from black through the spectrum toward orange. When the iron reached working heat, he took it to the large anvil and began to work, and the sound of the hammer on hot iron rang out from the open door of Pruitt's Ironworks across the south lane and down toward the river. Thomas Pruitt came home from school at 3:30 and heard the forge from the edge of the property. He stopped walking for a moment and listened to the hammer rhythm, a rhythm he had known all his life, which he associated with the normal operating state of his father's world, and then he went inside the shop to help. Earl did not fully explain the morning to Thomas that afternoon. He said that the bank situation had been resolved and that the shop was staying open. Thomas looked at his father's face for a moment, reading the particular quality of relief there, and he did not ask for more than that. He picked up the broom and started sweeping. Ruth knew by the time Earl came in for supper. She had heard from a neighbor who had heard from someone at the feed yard. She did not ask him to confirm the details. She put dinner on the table and they ate, and at some point during the meal she reached across and put her hand on his arm and left it there for a moment, and that was all that needed to be said about it. Wayne left Glenwood Springs the following morning. He had gone that afternoon to the hotel desk and spoken briefly to the front desk manager about his bill and his departure time, and he had driven out on Highway 6 heading west before the temperature had reached freezing the next day. A man at the fuel station on the east end of town saw him fill the truck and pull back onto the highway, heading toward Grand Junction, and that was the last confirmed sighting of him in Garfield County that autumn. Hector Aldrich, out at the Basalt Ranch, received a phone call from Wayne the following week from somewhere in Nevada, a brief call in which Wayne mentioned the situation at the Glenwood Springs shop as a passing note in a longer conversation about nothing in particular. Aldrich would not repeat the content of that conversation for many years. What he did say when people asked was that Wayne had seemed satisfied, not proud, not gratified in any demonstrative way, but satisfied. The way a man is satisfied when something that was in the wrong position is back in the right position and the world is operating as it should. By the spring of 1960, the forge at Pruitt's Iron Works was burning 6 days a week. The winter of 1959 into 1960 had been hard in the mountain valleys, as Colorado winters tended to be, and hard winters were reliable seasons for blacksmith work, frozen equipment, snapped hardware, horses that needed specialized winter shoes with borium welded to the heels and toes for traction on ice. Earl had built up a backlog by January that carried him through February. He had made the first independent payment to Mountain States Bank on May 15, 1960, the exact date specified in Gerald Foss's letter, and he had made it in full and on time. Gerald Foss had processed the payment without comment, but the processing note in the account file, which Foss had initialed himself, a minor departure from standard procedure, read "Payment made in full and on time, account in good standing." That May payment was the first of a long, unbroken sequence. By the fall of 1960, 1 year from the October morning in which Earl had stood in his doorway watching the forge smoke not rise, the shop was operating at nearly 80% of its best historical revenue. The recovery had come from several directions simultaneously. The horseshoeing trade had stabilized. The culling of the horse herds in the region had reached its floor, and the operations that remained were committed to the animals they kept and were willing to pay for quality work. A new road-building operation out of Grand Junction had begun contracting in Garfield County and had found Earl through a referral from Pete Morales, the contractor who had lost the previous work to the larger operation. The new firm needed ironwork fabricated to specific tolerances that their own shop could not match, and Earl's precision, developed over nearly 20 years and sharpened by the near loss of the shop that had produced a particular kind of clarity about what he was building and why, was exactly what they needed. Thomas, now 14, was in the shop every afternoon after school and all day Saturday. Earl had begun teaching him the horseshoeing work specifically, starting with the observation phase, watching Earl read a horse's movement, watching him assess the hoof wall angle and the balance of weight distribution, before graduating to the handling of tools. Thomas had the instinct for it, which was something that either existed or did not and could not be manufactured by instruction. He also had the patience that the work required, which was perhaps the rarer quality. In the spring of 1961, a year and a half after the morning at Mountain States Bank, Earl Pruitt paid off 6 months of the commercial loan ahead of schedule. Gerald Foss processed the prepayment without comment and applied it to the account correctly. The loan, which had originally been structured as a 15-year instrument, was now tracking toward payoff in 11 years. There was a morning in March of 1961 that Patricia Pruitt, home for a weekend from the nursing program she had enrolled in at Colorado Women's College in Denver, later described as the moment she understood what had happened the previous autumn. She came down to the kitchen before dawn and found her father already up, drinking coffee at the kitchen table. Through the window she could see the faint glow of the forge already burning in the shop, which meant he had been out there before coming in for coffee, going out in the March dark to start the fire so the shop would be at working temperature when the day began. It was a thing he had always done, but she had never before noticed the particular quality of ease with which he did it, the absence of the thing she had seen in his posture through the last year, the specific weight of a man who does not know if the work he is doing is building toward something or only delaying its end. That morning in March, the weight was gone. He was a man tending his fire. She sat down across from him and drank coffee with him in the dark, and after a while she said, "Dad, do you know why he did it?" Earl looked at his coffee for a moment. Then he said, "I think he just didn't like to see good work go dark." Patricia sat with that for a moment and then said, "That's enough reason." Earl looked up at her and almost smiled. "It's enough," he agreed. By 1962, 3 years after the morning at Mountain States Bank, Pruitt's Ironworks had become something that it had always had the potential to become but had never quite reached during the difficult years of the mid-1950s. A business that was known not just regionally but across the wider corridor of the Western Slope as the premier horseshoeing and ironwork operation between Grand Junction and Aspen. The reputation was specific and earned. Earl had taken on 2 apprentices, a young man from Carbondale named David Reyes, who was a cousin of Albert Reyes at the Hotel Colorado, and a 16-year-old from a ranch family up 4 Mile Creek named Merle Say, the son of Randall Say, whose horse Copperhead had started the chain of referrals that had briefly restored the shop's fortunes in 1957. The presence of 2 apprentices meant that the shop now had the capacity to take on work that Earl alone could not have managed, and the increased capacity attracted clients who had previously gone elsewhere out of scheduling necessity. The shop's revenue in the calendar year 1962 was $14,300 against operating costs of $8,900, leaving a net of $5,400, figures that represented a margin of stability Earl had never previously achieved. He kept a ledger of these numbers with the same precision he brought to his metalwork, and on the first day of 1963, sitting at the kitchen table with Ruth and his coffee, and the ledger open in front of him, he drew a single line under the final entry for 1962 and wrote next to it, in the margins, "Shop stands." It was the closest he came to writing about what had happened in October of 1959. The far reach of Pruitt's Ironworks extended further than anyone in Glenwood Springs had expected in 1959. By 1971, 12 years after the morning at Mountain States Bank, Thomas Pruitt had taken over the day-to-day operation of the shop, while Earl, at 56, moved into the supervisory and client relations role that his accumulated reputation supported. Thomas was 25, married to a woman named Karen from Carbondale, with a daughter born in 1969 named June. He was an exceptional horseshoer. Better, several clients said, than his father, which Earl received without dispute because he had been watching Thomas develop for 15 years and knew it was true. The shop had grown to 3 full-time smiths working under Thomas, and the fabrication side of the business had expanded to include custom gate and fence hardware for the resort development that was beginning to reshape the valley economy as ski country grew, and the wealthy who followed skiing began to build in the mountain towns. In the spring of 1971, Thomas Pruitt paid off the commercial loan on the Pruitt's Ironworks property. The payoff came 18 months ahead of the loan's original maturity date. The payment was made at Mountain States Bank, which was still operating on Grand Avenue in Glenwood Springs, though Gerald Foss had retired in 1969 and been replaced by a younger manager who knew the Pruitt account only as a long, clean record of on-time payments and a final satisfied payoff. Thomas brought the payoff check in person and sat at the manager's desk while the paperwork was processed. And when the deed came back to him released and clear of the bank's lien, he held it in both hands and looked at it for a long time. He brought it home and gave it to his father. Earl Pruitt held the deed for a moment and looked at the document, the legal description of the lot, the building, the shop he had built in 1940 and expanded in 1944, and nearly lost in 1959. Now free and clear, and belonging to the Pruitt family, without encumbrance. He folded it once along an existing crease and carried it to the kitchen, where Ruth was making dinner. He set it on the counter next to her, and she dried her hands and picked it up and read it, and then set it down and turned back to the stove without saying anything for a moment. Then she said, "Put it somewhere we won't lose it." Earl took it to the desk in the small room off the kitchen that had served as his office since they moved into the house in 1944. He opened the bottom left drawer of the desk and took out a cardboard folder that he had maintained for years, in which he kept the important documents of the shop's history: the original lease from 1940, the purchase agreement from 1944, the promissory note from the bank, and, still in its original fold, the letter from Mountain States Bank dated October 22, 1959, confirming that the arrears of $4,260 had been paid in full and that 6 monthly payments had been prepaid through April of 1960. He placed the paid-off deed behind the October 1959 letter and closed the folder and put it back in the drawer. He did not frame the letter. He did not display it. He kept it the way he kept all the documents of consequence in his life, in order, accessible, in the place where he would always know to find it. But the existence of the letter was not a secret. Thomas knew about it. David Reyes, the apprentice who had become a full partner in the business by 1968, knew about it. Albert Reyes at the Hotel Colorado had long since told the story to anyone who asked and some who hadn't, with the characteristic precision of a man who had been a witness to the early portion of it: the lobby at 7 in the morning, the coffee, the bank letter, the economy of the conversation. Dale Whitfield at his hardware store on Grand Avenue had told it a different way. He told it as a business story, the story of a shop that had survived a near failure and been rebuilt into something better than it had been before. He told it when young business owners came to him worried about their own margins, and he emphasized not the rescue but what came after the rescue: the work, the years, the apprentices, the payoff in 1971. He told it as evidence that surviving a crisis was not the end of the story, only the beginning of the harder part. The young man who remembered it longest was Merle Say, who had been one of Earl's apprentices and who, by 1975, was operating his own farriery business out of Carbondale, serving the Roaring Fork Valley's growing horse population. Merle had been 17 years old when the rescue occurred, just beginning his apprenticeship at Pruitt's Iron Works, still learning to build and control fire in a forge. He had not been present at the bank. He had not seen the money laid on the desk. But he had been in the shop the afternoon that Earl came back and lit the forge, and he had watched Earl work the iron that afternoon with a quality of concentration and purpose that was different from what Merle had seen in the weeks preceding. He could not have said what was different, not then. Later he would understand that he had been watching a man who knew again what he was working toward. Merle Say kept that memory. When he opened his own shop in Carbondale in 1975, he hung a framed print on the wall near his own forge, a photograph of a working blacksmith at an anvil, anonymous, purchased from a photographer in Denver. He hung it not as decoration but as a reminder of a specific quality of attention. He did not explain the photograph to clients who asked about it. He said only that it reminded him of where he had learned to work. In the summer of 1987, Patricia Pruitt, by then a registered nurse working in a Denver hospital, married to a doctor named Collins, with 3 children of her own, came back to Glenwood Springs for a family gathering that brought Earl and Ruth and Thomas and Karen and the grandchildren together for a week, at the house adjacent to the shop. Earl was 72 years old that summer. He had not worked the forge in 3 years, leaving that entirely to Thomas and the shop's current crew of 4 smiths. But he was in the shop every morning for at least an hour, drinking coffee by the forge while Thomas and the others worked, available for the questions that a man with 50 years of iron knowledge accumulates the answers to. Patricia's oldest child, a boy of 15 named James Collins, spent time in the shop during that week and was fascinated by the work in the way that adolescents are fascinated by things that involve fire and transformation. He asked Earl about the history of the shop, and Earl told him pieces of it, unhurried, over the course of several mornings. He told him about arriving in Glenwood Springs in 1940. He told him about building the shop building in 1941. He told him about the drought years in the 1950s and the decline of the horse trade and the slow accumulation of financial pressure that had brought the shop to its worst point. He told him about the letter from the bank in September of 1959. James asked, "What happened then?" Earl was quiet for a moment. He was watching Thomas work at the anvil, watching the particular economy of motion that Thomas had developed, the efficiency of someone who had done a thing many thousands of times and had refined every gesture to its minimum necessary component. "A man came by and looked at the shop," Earl said, "and decided it shouldn't close." "What man?" Earl looked at his grandson. "John Wayne," he said. James Collins sat with that for a moment. He was 15 and knew the name and the films and the general outline of the public life, the way everyone of his generation knew them. "The actor?" he said. "Among other things," Earl said. He stood up from the stool where he had been sitting and carried his coffee cup to the shelf by the door and set it down. He was also a man who knew what a working shop was worth, and he didn't think it was right to let one close for $4,000. He went back inside the house and left James sitting in the shop, listening to the rhythm of Thomas's hammer on the anvil. James Collins never forgot that morning. He would mention it, in various contexts over the following decades, with the quality of a formative story. Not because the story made him feel something in the moment of hearing it, but because it kept arriving in his mind in later years at unexpected times. When he was in medical school and watching a hospital administrator make a decision that reduced care access to save a budget line, he thought about $4,260 and 6 stacks of bills on a bank manager's desk. When he took his own first job as a physician and felt the particular weight of being asked to choose between what was right and what was procedurally correct, he thought about it again. He did not speak of it often, but it was there, in the background of how he understood the relationship between a person with resources and a situation that required them to be used. In the spring of 1991, Thomas Pruitt received an inquiry from a historian at the Colorado Historical Society in Denver, who was compiling oral histories of Western Slope businesses and their role in the regional economy of the post-war period. The historian, a woman named Dr. Ellen Marsh, drove out from Denver in April and spent 2 days in Glenwood Springs conducting interviews. She spoke to Thomas about the shop's history, its operations, its place in the local ranch economy. She visited the shop and photographed the forge and the anvils and the wall tools. She asked Thomas about the critical moments in the shop's history, the difficult periods, the near failures, the turning points. Thomas told her about October of 1959. He told her the full story, in the direct, sequential way that his father had always told things. Facts in order, without embellishment. He told her the amount. He told her Wayne's name. He told her about the lobby at the Hotel Colorado and the bank office and the money counted on the desk. Ellen Marsh listened without interrupting and took careful notes, and then asked Thomas whether there was any documentation. Thomas went to the desk in the office, not the kitchen desk, which had been his father's, but the shop office desk, where the folder had eventually come to rest when Earl gave up the kitchen desk in his late 70s, and he took out the cardboard folder and laid it open on the desk. Ellen Marsh sat across from him and looked at the documents in order. The original lease from 1940, the purchase agreement, the promissory note, and there, in the folder, still in its original fold, the letter from Mountain States Bank, dated October 22, 1959, on bank letterhead, signed by Gerald Foss, confirming payment of $4,260 in arrears and 6 monthly payments prepaid through April 1960. She looked at it for a long time. "May I make a copy of this?" she asked. "You can," Thomas said. She copied it on the shop's small copier and returned the original to the folder and watched Thomas put the folder back in the drawer. "The original is still in there?" she said. "It's been in there since the week it arrived," Thomas said. "My father kept it." Ellen Marsh's oral history report on Pruitt's Ironworks and its place in the Garfield County economy of the 1950s and 1960s was completed in the autumn of 1991 and filed with the Colorado Historical Society's archive in Denver. The report included, as supporting documentation, the copied letter from Mountain States Bank, dated October 22, 1959. The report noted, without further elaboration, that the financial crisis of 1959 had been resolved by the direct personal intervention of a private individual whose identity the historical record confirmed as John Wayne, and that the intervention had preserved a working operation that subsequently remained in continuous family operation for more than 30 years. The report was not widely read. Historical Society archives rarely are, but it was there, catalogued and accessible for anyone who looked. In the summer of 1997, June Pruitt, Thomas and Karen's daughter, born in 1969, now 28 years old and running a small craft metalwork business out of a studio in Carbondale, drove to Denver and found the oral history report in the Historical Society's archive. She read it completely. She had known the story all her life, had heard versions of it from her father and from her grandmother Ruth before Ruth passed in 1989, and from the various Glenwood Springs residents who kept it circulating in the particular way that formative local stories circulate. But reading it in the archive, in the flat, specific language of a historian's document, with the copied letter from Mountain States Bank reproduced on the page before her in Gerald Foss's typewritten certifications, was a different experience. She sat in the archive reading room for a long time. She took a photocopy of the report with her when she left. She drove back to Carbondale and went to the shop in Glenwood Springs and found her father and asked him if she could see the original letter. Thomas opened the drawer and took out the cardboard folder and laid it on the desk and opened it. The letter was there, where it had always been, behind the October 1959 bank notice and in front of the 1971 deed of payoff. The paper had aged to a light cream color, and the typewriter ink had faded from black to a deep gray, but the text was fully legible and the signature of Gerald Foss at the bottom was clear. June looked at it for a moment, then she asked Thomas if she could take it out of the folder. He said yes. She held it in both hands the way Earl had held it on October 22, 1959, at the desk in the glass-walled office of Mountain States Bank, and she read it completely. "This needs to be somewhere people don't forget it," she said. Thomas looked at her. "It's in the Historical Society archive," he said. "It needs to be in the shop," she said. She took the letter to a framing shop in Glenwood Springs, a place called Mountain Frame and Gallery on 7th Street, operated by a man named Paul Vierick, who had been framing artwork and documents for the Valley's residents since 1979. She had it archivally matted and placed in a simple frame of dark walnut, with UV protective glass. The framing cost $47. She brought it back to the shop and hung it on the back wall, to the left of the calendar hook where the October 1959 calendar had hung when the forge went dark and Earl had stood in the doorway looking at the empty street. She hung it herself, with her father watching from the doorway. Thomas looked at it for a moment, the cream-colored paper with the Mountain States Bank letterhead, the specific language of a debt retired, the date of October 22, 1959, and Gerald Foss's signature, and behind the glass the particular weight of a document that had meant the difference between a shop that continued and a shop that ended. He would have liked that, Thomas said. Earl Pruitt had died in March of 1995, at the age of 80, in the house adjacent to the shop where he had lived since 1944. He had died in his own bed, with Ruth gone 6 years before him, and Thomas and Karen and June present in the house. He had not spoken much in the final weeks, but on the last full day he was able to have a sustained conversation. He had asked Thomas to bring him a cup of coffee, and had held it in both hands and looked out the window toward the shop and said, without particular context, "Keep the fire going." Thomas had said he would. The forge at Pruitt's Iron Works was burning when Earl died the following morning. Thomas had gone out at 5 in the morning and built the fire before coming back to the house to sit with his father, and the smoke was rising from the stack when Earl's breathing stopped just after 8 o'clock. It was March, cold, the kind of Colorado morning that still had ice on the river and frost on the windows, and the smoke from the forge went straight up into the still air above the South Lane, visible from Grand Avenue, visible from the Hotel Colorado 6 blocks away, visible from the road above the canyon wall, where the aspens would not leaf out for another 6 weeks. The framed letter on the back wall of the shop was the first thing June saw every morning when she arrived to open the building for the day. She had taken over operations of the shop from Thomas in 2002, when Thomas retired at 56, the same age Earl had stepped back, and she had run it since then with the combination of technical precision and client attention that was apparently a Pruitt inheritance that passed regardless of which generation was holding the hammer. She had 2 smiths working for her and a full calendar of horseshoeing clients and fabrication contracts, and she had never missed a payment on anything. She rarely spoke about the letter unprompted. When clients or visitors noticed it and asked, she told the story in a few sentences. The bank letter, the 5 days remaining, the man who came through the shop door and went with her grandfather to the bank and paid $4,260 and 6 months of forward payments, and then told Earl Pruitt to get his forge lit. She told it without drama and without embellishment, in the same direct way the Pruitts told everything. Some clients had heard of John Wayne and some had not, and June found that it made no particular difference to the story. The story was not about who he was. The story was about what he had done and what it had produced. A shop that was still burning, more than 40 years later, on the same quarter-acre lot on the South Lane of Glenwood Springs, Colorado, where a man named Earl Pruitt had built a forge in 1941 and worked it for 5 decades and handed it to his son and his granddaughter and kept the fire going through all of it. The cardboard folder with the original documents was still in the bottom left drawer of the office desk. The framed letter on the wall was a copy, archivally preserved. The original was in the folder, behind the bank notice from September 1959 and in front of the 1971 deed of payoff, where Earl had put it on the day the transaction was complete and where nobody had moved it since. In Garfield County, Colorado, the story of the morning at Mountain States Bank in October of 1959 had become the kind of thing that circulates without needing a fixed carrier, told at the hardware store and the feed yard and the diner on Grand Avenue, told by Albert Reyes's family and the Say family and the Whitfield family and the Carbondale business community that had known Earl and then Thomas and now June Pruitt for 60-plus years. The amounts were always exact in the telling. $4,260 in arrears, 6 months of forward payments, $6,300 total, counted onto the desk in a glass-walled office on Grand Avenue on a cold October morning. Nobody who told the story ever got the amount wrong, because the amount was the point, the specific, counted, deliberate weight of what one person had chosen to do with what he had. The Hotel Colorado still stands in Glenwood Springs. The lobby where Wayne sat with Earl Pruitt at 7 in the morning on October 22, 1959, drinking coffee by the fire, the Stetson on his knee, and the bank letter on the low table between them, is substantially unchanged from what it was that morning. The fireplace is there. The chairs are there. The chandelier lights still burn in the morning hours when the temperature outside is below freezing. Pruitt's Ironworks is still on the south lane, still marked by the sign in dark red letters, repainted 4 times since Earl's first repainting, always in the same typeface, always the same color, because some things you do not change when they are right. The forge burns 6 days a week. The smoke rises from the stack and drifts toward the river in the prevailing October wind, visible from the road along the canyon wall, visible to anyone who knows to look for it. On the back wall of the shop, to the left of where the calendar hook used to be, in a frame of dark walnut with UV protective glass, is a letter on Mountain States Bank letterhead dated October 22, 1959, signed by Gerald Foss, stating in the specific language of institutional obligation, cured that the arrears of $4,260 have been paid in full, and that 6 monthly payments have been prepaid through April of 1960. The names on the letter are Earl Pruitt and Mountain States Bank. Another name does not appear in the document itself. But everyone in the shop knows whose money is in it. A man who has built something worth keeping deserves to know it will stand, and sometimes all it takes is one other man who recognizes the same thing.